Well, hello and welcome to EMG 6701. This is Dr. David Milan. I am your professor, if you haven't figured that one out yet. I'll be working alongside you throughout the semester as well as looking at your discussion board postings, but perhaps if we have those throughout the term, as well as your face-to-face component that we are doing now, as well as dealing with our papers and submissions that we have throughout the term. So it's just going to depend whether we're in a life-paced learning class or if we're going to be dealing with our normal discussion board postings. We shall see as we work through our term and our term management. So this week in our first session, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our first three units. So this is part one of three. We're going to do three different units. Part two will cover sections 4 through 6 or units 4 through 6, and then we'll take a look at units 7 and 8 in our third collaborative session. So this is obviously unit 1. Unit 1 is going to cover units 1 through 3 for the first collaborative session, and we're going to look at a host of things. We're going to be looking at just some disasters. We're going to be looking at flooding, how FEMA is going to make an impact upon assisting us during these times of flooding and hurricanes, and we'll also take a look at some historical factors regarding hurricanes as well. And we'll touch on wildland firefighting techniques as well as wildland fires that have impacted us here in the United States. So without further ado, we'll take a look at this first slide here. And what we're looking at is the psychological impacts of disasters. So, oftentimes there are accidents or disasters that are being for the first responding units on scene that can create a psychological impact or a psychological footprint, as we say, that can last for quite some time. Now, these psychological footprints are not going to be something perhaps that'll be over with and done with once the incident has ceased. It can go on perhaps for days, it can go on perhaps for weeks, and it might not reappear for a year or two. And sometimes it's going to take a trigger event, as we usually say, to kind of stimulate that recollection from that traumatic event that maybe that first responder had seen previously. So, for example, if there's going to be an active threat or active shooter situation that made an impact upon that first responder, although the first responder may not show any signs and symptoms initially, it might take a year or two, and perhaps it might be something that he or she sees on television, or maybe perhaps it might be another event that takes place that the first responder is going to respond to once again, and that can make a difference too. So a lot of times we think of ourselves in the firefighting world, the police world, and the alphabet police world. That's ATF, FBI, EMS, etc. That's the alphabet police. But what we take a look at is we feel that we are superheroes. We feel that nothing can knock us down, nothing can get in our way, and we feel that we can cope with these situations on a daily basis and continually take it into ourselves and not tell anyone about it or not express our thoughts and ideas and our feelings about what we just may have witnessed. Let's face it. When you're in public service and you're dealing with a lot of these situations out in the street, a lot of people don't deal with this stuff on a daily basis or may never see anything like this in their entire lives, let alone maybe once. But perhaps if we're dealing with this every day that we're going to work, this is what we signed up for. And if we're dealing with traumatic situations or if we're dealing with flooding events or pandemic events, whatever it may be, this is going to take a psychological toll on us one way or another. So we're not superheroes. And then that invincible feeling comes over us, that euphoric attitude that we have, that you can conquer everything. Yes, we have that adrenaline rush right when the call comes in or right when we're dealing with those situations at a high level, when we feel that adrenaline rush comes in and we feel invincible, that nothing's going to knock us off the stool, shall we say. Well, unfortunately, those aren't the situations and cases. When we're feeling invincible, that's when we are the most vulnerable, because it's that euphoric sense of compassion for ourselves that we have. And then all of a sudden, once we calm down, we crash rapidly. And keep that in mind. Once that euphoria wears off, you feel that new low once you're involved with the next situation, and you're going to feel a very, very lethargic feeling inside your body as well as psychologically. And then you have these unreal expectations. Everything's just going to be fine. This is going to be working out excellent in this situation, regardless of how terrible the situation may be, if it's going to be dealing with flooding, hurricane, levees breaking, whatever it may be, the unreal expectation in your mind psychologically is going to play tricks on you. And we all have that. We all experience that. And the reason why is because all three of these combine. We feel we are the superhero responding to these events. We feel that we are going to be invincible regardless of what's being thrown at us. And then that unreal expectation that everyone is going to be okay and that everything is going to be all right. When in reality, there are going to be some situations that are going to be compromising us. In reality, there's going to be some situations where, unfortunately, some people are going to be compromised with their own situation, whether it's going to be levees breaking and the need to evacuate, or if they're stuck and sheltered in place, or whatever the situation may be. We have to understand that these are unreal expectations, and we have to bring realism into it. So the psychological impacts here, oftentimes with accidents, disasters, and the first responding units on the scene, are definitely something we need to look at psychologically. And we also feel that we are superheroes. We have that invincibility. And then, of course, we have those unreal expectations setting in. And moving forward here in slide 2, we can see that psychological and behavioral health are two of the main areas that we need to consider when creating a policy, and for training and educational purposes, as well as being able to identify some of those signs and symptoms that may be occurring. Oftentimes, the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, issues can arise from these events. We oftentimes hear that in regards to our military personnel returning back from overseas and seeing some of the things that they have seen, experiencing some of those experiences that very few of us probably have ever witnessed, and also understanding that these are psychological impacts too. If it's the loss of a loved one, if it's a loss of a comrade or a close friend and companion, these are some of the areas that are going to make an impact for post-traumatic stress disorder too. So that being said, there needs to be networking, and I don't mean going by social media and saying this, but networking within that group, being able to express your feelings, being able to express what you have experienced both psychologically and emotionally. A lot of times we go back to that first slide where we feel like we're superheroes and nothing bothers us. We're invincible and no one needs to speak with us and no one needs to talk to us about the situations and I can handle it type of deal. Well, in most instances, that's a fallacy, and that's due to the fact that we're all human and we all have a weaker side, and eventually this all catches up to us. There's only so many walls that we can build, even around us as police and fire and EMS and so many others that are working out there in the public agencies that feel that they're invincible as a person, when in reality they're not. So the networking comes in where you have a good group of people that are willing to listen and say, hey, we notice that there's something been bothering you lately. You might have a high irritability. You might be extremely depressed. You might be super or hyper aroused with something, or you may be completely the opposite of who you are. You may be an extrovert and you may be an introvert. And then it might be the opposite of being an introvert, and then you're an extrovert and continually speaking and talking out of turn. And it might be gibberish at some points. It just depends on the situation. So the psychological well-being is definitely needed in emergency services management and in general for all our public officials and officers as well as military. But you need to understand that it's not just being there, but it's training and education, understanding that these are the signs and symptoms, understanding that you may feel this way or others within your group may feel this way as well. And then being able to identify those signs and symptoms will come into play once you understand that these factors are going to be initialized by an event. So PTSD issues are stemmed from a lot of these traumatic incidents. It depends, much as I've mentioned in previous classes, it just depends. It just depends on the incident, it depends on the event, it depends on how the person is going to be feeling, how the person is going to deal with the given situation. And then the networking, of course, being able to discuss this with someone or perhaps a group of someones that understand the situation, have been there or have felt the same way perhaps that you have in regards to that particular incident. And a lot of times being able to debrief yourself with other people in the room in similar circumstances and situations will definitely make an impact psychologically as well as inside yourself, because you're able to release a lot of those feelings and minimize some of the stressors and some of the tensions that you probably have had built up since that particular incident had taken place. In our next slide, we'll kind of take a look at the inability to care for first responders as well as the community representatives who may have been impacted by a disaster that can definitely make matters worse. And you're saying, well, how can that be? We're all supposed to be working together. Well, if the first responders don't have the ability to work alongside community representatives, community stakeholders, political stakeholders, then it's going to make it that much more difficult to perform their jobs. Hence, it's a lot more difficult to promote education and training opportunities, and interjurisdictional relations are definitely going to suffer at this time. So it can make matters a lot worse. Psychological support is definitely something that's needed in any type of disaster. And again, the footprint may last for 1 to 2 years, and then all of a sudden it may come up once again, just triggered by something that is going to trigger that event, and something that we're going to see perhaps quite often in our fields, or perhaps it might be a year or two down the line that might be something different and trigger a particular event that we've felt before. And then we have behavioral health intervention. And a lot of times we as superheroes and the invincible ones, we don't like to have that behavioral health intervention. Behavioral health intervention is something that works with the people that are definitely impacted by an event, and that may be what we refer to in emergency services management on edge, due to the fact that they're stressed out and they need someone to talk to. They need someone to release this. However, the superhero and the invincibility takes over, and they don't feel that they have the need to speak to anyone. However, based on a cohesive group, and perhaps even the suggestion of a mentor or a friend, sometimes that might be able to stimulate the person to go and speak with someone in dealing with the behavioral health and behavioral health interventions. So the inability to care for the first responders definitely can have an impact upon first responders that are going to be arriving on the scene. They're not going to be thinking clearly. They might be feeling that they're left out. They may be feeling that they're alone as such. And many times they're going to have to minimize their own stressors, perhaps through the use of drugs and alcohol, because of the things that they have witnessed. And this isn't going to be something that's very out in the open. This is going to be something that's probably going on behind closed doors in order to minimize a lot of those stressors that we don't see that person may be going through. And again, this goes back to definitely something that is needed for first responders and healthcare professionals in general, needing that behavioral health people and needing to discuss a lot of things that need to be looked at in terms of what took place on an event, or perhaps even how to minimize some of those stressors. So behavioral health intervention can be beneficial not only for first responders on scene that may need it immediately, but also for first responders who fall into that category of having that footprint that may be within 1 or 2 years after the event has taken place. Next, we're shifting gears here just a little bit. Going from the psychological aspect, we're going to fire. And we're dealing with fire, and a natural force that is going to make an impact upon human beings, animals, as well as the environment in general. So when we use it in a structured atmosphere, it has many different types of benefits. So what we're looking at in a structured atmosphere, meaning that training and education here and dealing with tabletop exercises, this will help dealing with wildland fires, dealing with chemical fires, as well as house fires. So let's take these in order here. Let's take a look at wildland fires first. In looking at wildland fires, these are something that are not too often with frequency in many locations in the United States. However, open and barren plains, and of course we see where it happens many times in California, Southern California, as well as Arizona and perhaps Nevada in some places, Colorado in the mountains. And we look, many of these areas have been impacted by fires due to the fact that one, it could be carelessness, two, it could be something of from a lightning strike that sparks something in the field with dry timber that is completely natural and unintentional, or many times it might be something that is set intentionally to start this fire and create a conflagration. Many times we have seen where, unfortunately, volunteer firefighters that are looking for monies and looking for hours have started fires. And it's crazy to even say, but we've seen that countless times out in Colorado as well as California, for example. And those aren't the only locations. I'm just using those as examples, as those are true examples for what our practical purposes are in the course, as well as real life examples. So not only do we have that issue, but we have to deal with how we're going to put out those fires, the use of personnel power, how many personnel that are going to be required, not only from that state, but perhaps surrounding states, other jurisdictions, as well as the resources that are going to be used out there. Human resources are going to be at the front lines trying to mitigate those circumstances with wildland fires and dealing with the harsh terrain and the harsh situations, and walking perhaps miles before they can actually get to the fire due to the terrain that's there, and then having to fight that fire. So there's a lot involved there. Chemical fires are a little bit different. These are in more industrialized areas and industrialized settings. Your rail yards, your companies and corporations that are making fabrics and steel and such. These are going to occur. The companies that are dealing with hazardous materials, that's an obvious one. But you can understand that there's a big difference between a fire that's going to be started in grass or with twigs, as opposed to a chemical fire. Normally, a chemical fire is going to be with the carelessness or a spill, and a spill that can be initiated by just a spark, or the chemical might be very hazardous and it might be ignited when it comes into either air, water, or some type of other liquid. And a lot of these chemical fires may take hours, perhaps even days to put out. And that's where a lot of resources, again, are going to be used, they're going to be needed, and personnel may need to be shifted out due to the fact that there may be fatigue from battling blazes from a chemical fire. Again, it'll depend on the chemical. And finally, we're looking at house fires here. Now, house fires, we relatively see them almost daily, unfortunately, in the news, and these can be very tricky because house, you don't understand what is occurring inside the house. There may be different areas. There may be a lot of boxes, papers, and other materials that are unbeknownst to you when you're entering into that house. If you happen to be a firefighter, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it can be very difficult to try and rescue a person if they happen to be trapped in a house that is completely full in very narrow pathways and passages in order to get to that person wherever he or she may be located. And house fires continually go down due to the fact that we do have better preparation. We do have better education. We do have training out there. And the fire departments offer their inspections. They also offer the smoke detectors and various packages that they put together in order to minimize some of the fire hazards that can occur in the home. Plus, children are more educated now than ever regarding technology and the use of some of the technology that they have, creating the realism, and also they have survive alive homes that the children can also go into and crawl around and understand some of the dangers and issues when the smoke is arising, and what they should do, how they should get out, etc. Again, it goes back to training and education for not only adults, but humans as well. Well, I guess kids are humans. Yeah, we could say that, but kids as well. So fires is definitely going to be a natural force. It's going to impact humans, animals, and the environment. Those three areas. And then when there's a structured atmosphere, you're looking at three different areas. One of the structures is dealing with wildland out in the environment. Your chemical fires dealing with the industry that's surrounding you, and then of course the residential or your house fires. These are the main areas to consider when we're dealing with the impacts of natural disasters such as a fire is concerned. Now, those of you who have been traumatized, I mean, who have had me for another course before, you can understand that you need leadership in all these situations here. And a lot of times, leadership comes from working with experience as well as educational opportunities. So, just a quick recap from our leadership course. If you haven't taken it already, you will, and you will need to know about this anyway. So this may be a good review for you, or this might be something that permits you to be a visionary. A good leader is going to be able to run the operation even with numerous personalities that are going to be conflicting. I'm sure none of you who are in emergency services management or dealing with police and fire have ever run into someone who just wants to take charge of the scene. If you are saying so, you're lying. what we need to do is work alongside one another, folks, and that's the whole point here: is working alongside each other and not being able to say that I'm in charge and I'm just running the show and whatever I have to say is the only way of doing it. The authoritarian approach to a disaster or an emergency response has a lot of caveats, and the caveats create a lack of communication, a lack of flexibility, and a lack of team effort, and also an unwillingness of that team to work alongside you. People like to have their voices heard, and people like to have an opportunity to say, hey, this is what we've seen out there, perhaps this is one of the avenues that we can do, and you take that under consideration as a good leader. Some of the qualities that you can see here that a good leader will possess will be flexibility, being able to follow policy, being a visionary, and then being fair with all personnel that are involved in these situations. Now, the flexibility comes with a combination of the policy and what's going on the scene. Much as I have probably mentioned in previous lectures, something changes in an emergency scene every 2 seconds. Whether it's going to be levee breaking, whether it's going to be flooding, if it's an evacuation, or if it's going to be the need to move the incident command post to a different location. Flexibility occurs when you're not exactly following policy. But hold, policy is good. Policy is wonderful. You need to have policy because it is the foundation and it is the basics that are out there in order for us to comprehend and then possess and then being able to put that into our emergency situation. But policy doesn't indicate on page 32 if the levees start to break and fail and how many people are going to be evacuated, what supplies are going to be needed, if there's going to be radio communication, or has radio communication failed. It's not all going to be there. So being flexible as a leader definitely will have its privileges in the long run. The ability to follow policy is good. Again, as I mentioned, it is a foundation. Policy provides an opportunity not to have legal issues later on down the line, because the question always arises, did you follow policy? You always say, yes, I did follow policy. And of course, there are situations that warranted different approaches to this. So following policy was our top priority, but in this situation, it didn't spell it out in here. We had to actually think outside the box and do this. So that is part of it, kind of dovetailing into being a visionary. If you're able to think outside the box, if you're able to foresee things and events that are going to take place, that will help your team, that will help your disposition, and that'll also help the people that are questioning what's going on, particularly your community stakeholders, as well as your political stakeholders that are asking the questions, because they need to know, and their constituents are asking, how much money are we going to need for this operation? Where's the money going to be coming from? Who's going to be providing the services that are being requested right now, etc. So it has to be open communication. And then finally, being fair with all personnel that are involved in these situations. It's very difficult to answer each and every question. It's very difficult to be on top of all things at all times. But you have to also remember that this is a fluid situation. It is going to be continually changing, and that people's suggestions do matter. You can write those suggestions down or have those logged in digitally or whatever you may be doing in an effort to kind of gather all these suggestions and thoughts and ideas together, and then make a final decision based on all those areas. And that's being fair with everyone. You can actually say, hey, you know what? I hear what you have to say here. Based on this is a great idea. Never really conceptualized that. I'll take that into consideration, and then you write that down, and then you move on to your next task. And that's one way that you're going to have your team buy in and believe in you, knowing that their opinions and thoughts and ideas matter. I can't tell you how many times that we've had team members in different emergency situations, both in disasters as well as just basic emergency responses, where they provided a suggestion and they were literally turned away based on their suggestion, and very coldly, I might add. And you could tell that the entire scene had changed psychologically, and the physical locality hadn't changed, but it's just the entire atmosphere itself had changed psychologically due to the fact that the harshness of the person that perhaps was in charge of that scene, and the declination of those thoughts and ideas from someone. If you don't have time to listen to someone during that particular incident, I think they'll understand, especially when there's water rushing, or especially if there happens to be a situation where it's just open and fluid and you need volunteers and all hands on deck, shall we say. So some of those situations are going to arise. Again, it depends on the matter. It depends on the situation. So don't feel slighted if your suggestion isn't accepted, or if it's a little bit terse and shortened at that particular time. It just deals with how the pressure is being handled and what the situation is dealing with. So, real quick summation on this slide. Being a good leader is going to be able to run the operation even with the different numerous personalities that you're going to encounter out there, and trying to minimize the conflict that may arise between one person and another, or perhaps yourself and another person who respectfully disagree on how to lead this operation. The good leader is going to be flexible, also being able to follow policy in regards to what has been developed and minimizing legal issues, being a visionary and forethought, and then finally being fair with all personnel that are involved in these situations that are going to arise. So, in looking at our wildland fires here, we can see that wildland fires are continuing to emerge. These locations are just happening, and it again can be due to heat and wind. There's no set location for the initial phase that is going to take place for these fires, and then planning, mitigation, and identification are going to be critical. And all community stakeholders need to be involved. So the locations can be in certain areas that are in the mountains. It can be in large areas that have open grassy fields that will be approaching impending homes. And it also can be in a little bit higher residential areas in the mountains, and these areas are going to be impacted quickly. And this wildland fires happen quickly, and the push and the rush is very, very fast. The winds can oftentimes have a roar, almost like a freight train sound, as well as create much heat, as well as the wind that may be generated inside these wildland fires. And it's due to the terrain, it's due to the wind, it's due to the topography that's out there, as well as perhaps some of the residents that unfortunately may have been destroyed. Fire knows no boundaries. Fire knows no strict pathways. When it's out of control, it's out of control, and it will take out whatever land or what's in its path. That's again where there's no set location for the initial phase. So if there's a lightning strike in one location and it happens to be against a barren land, and it happened to be with hay, or if it happened to be with dried up pine needles, or striking a pine tree and creating that fire, and the wind picks up, there you go. That's almost like the perfect storm. And then planning, mitigation, and identification. That comes from everyone, and that goes from the public agencies down through the private agencies and the community stakeholders, the people that are living and residing in those areas. Planning to identify some of the shortcomings out there, perhaps with the grass and the brush and some of the trees, and cleaning out gutters and such, and having an adequate barrier around the house that will minimize some of the fire potential damage that can occur. Those are some of the planning things and mitigation that can take place. And mitigation can also take place after an event had already occurred, going back and updating the policy, going back and renewing some of the thoughts and ideas that were there before, and now making that big change. And then, of course, identifying some of the areas. Identification is key. Knowing what is around you, knowing how much brush is around you, how many bushes are around you, the type of grass that is there, and trying to have clear pathways, perhaps a stone that should be placed in there rather than having grassy areas. All this are things that need to be looked at in planning for a wildland fire, especially if you happen to be in some of the locations that I had previously mentioned. So once again, these locations are continuing to emerge. Heat and wind are primary suspects for this, as well as Mother Nature in dealing with lightning strikes or other. And of course, you have, like I mentioned before, you have people that intentionally set fires. Again, there's no set location for this or the initial phase for it. And then you need to plan, mitigate, and then identify those areas that may be troublesome for firefighting personnel, as well as just the basic community stakeholders. And all community stakeholders need to be included in this in order to minimize some of the issues that can arise with wildland fires. And looking at slide 7 here, wildland fire mitigation. Some of the things that you can do to mitigate those circumstances that we talked about in the last slide is the distribution of educational materials. That's a basic one. And looking at those educational materials, that will provide you an opportunity to discuss with the community, your community stakeholders, your community political representatives, etc., in an effort to minimize some of the situations that can occur and teach them, say, hey, this is what's going on. This can be a major issue should there be a brush fire or something that gets started that we are unable to handle. So educating people and showing them some pictures perhaps from previous fires that had been taken in that particular community, that might be a start, as well as being able to have a face-to-face talk with community representatives. And that's where the community stakeholders become involved. Planning and being able to mitigate the situations can be beneficial, especially if you use community representatives who perhaps have been through a fire before, or perhaps have experienced the wildland fire in a different set of circumstances. Having them sit around the table and say, hey, this is what we did before, this is what happened to us, here's what was a challenge for us, and here are the challenges for the community, here's what we found out. That would be very beneficial, because now you can create that policy. Now you can move forward with what you need to move forward with, rather than just pulling it out of thin air. So community stakeholders can be the people that have resided in the community for quite some time and experienced perhaps one of those wildland fires. Here you also can see that cleaning gutters, cleaning brush, and clearing bushes and trimming them properly, etc., will minimize some of those areas where fires can be ignited and initiated. Cleaning the gutters out, why? Well, if you have dried leaves inside the gutters, dried pine needles, etc., that can initiate a fire, especially if it's swirling, and especially if these embers are going through the air and igniting certain small hot spots that can create a conflagration afterwards. Cutting the brush, getting the brush down, minimize, so this way if it does burn, it might not create a major situation there. I can recall one time, even in my neighborhood, where I was living near a prairie, and the gentleman decided to light the prairie on fire to burn off all the grass. Well, what he didn't know was that the fire was coming closer and closer to homes, and he had an unwanted disregard for that. I can recall looking at the flames that were about 15 feet high, because it finally reached that intensity and capacity, and I understand that sound of a roar as well as a freight train when it was coming, and luckily it died out prior to reaching our home, as well as the homes within our neighborhood. So I get it. Clean your brush. And I don't mean your paintbrush. I mean the brush that's around the house. Clear these things away, the debris or anything that might be an inclination for fire to grab onto, bushes, etc., and keep the gutters clean. Or if you have gutter guards or whatever may be up there, more power to you. But clearing the pathways and minimal grass will definitely be two of the main areas to look at in making sure that it's a little less chance of having a fire start. And of course, communication. working alongside the stakeholders, working alongside incident commanders, as well as your political stakeholders, and perhaps getting some grant funding for updated equipment, updated training, whatever it may be, that could possibly be needed. So there's a lot of things that are involved in wildland fires, not just watching it skip from tree to tree and grassland to grassland. It's a distribution of educational materials. It's community stakeholders being involved, cleaning out things and maintaining upkeep around the residents, maintaining clear pathways. Again, this sounds like all common sense things, but you would be amazed to see at how many times that this brush is overgrown, or there's many plants and bushes and things that are dry and that are leaning up against the house, creating an ignition source for a wildland fire. And then finally, communication. Communication is getting out there in the community, yes, but also being able to work alongside those that are in charge of the emergency scene prior to and during an incident. So we move forward from the hot stuff to the cool stuff. Well, not so cool, but flooding. We're using wet and water here. So let's talk about hurricanes and flooding. In looking at flooding can be caused by torrential rain, of course, and then tidal surges if you're along the coastal areas. If you happen to be in a prominent area where hurricanes are, especially during the months of June through October, you can probably expect that there are going to be some challenges. And the tidal surge is something that a lot of people need to be aware of, because they're oftentimes thinking it's not going to make a major impact. It's not going to impact my area. It's not going to impact the situation where I'm at. Tidal surges can be towering, and especially if your area happens to be either even with sea level or below sea level. If you happen to have a tidal surge that's going to be 15 feet and you're 5 feet below sea level, guess what? You're looking at 20-foot surge of water that's going to be coming in. And a lot of times, depending on the strength of the hurricane or the surge, it might go inland for a mile or two. It just depends on how strong this surge is going to be. And let's not forget about earthquakes in here causing flooding. You say, well, that's why I say earthquake. Well, yes, earthquake cause tsunamis. Tsunamis are out there at sea. Tsunamis can be unexpected, and especially if you have some of these very strong earthquakes, as we saw the one that hit Japan in 2011, you can see the enormity of what a tsunami does. And the water pulls out, and all of a sudden there's a lot of beach, and then all of a sudden it comes back with a vengeance and pushes through. And some of these walls of water can be going at an excessive rate of speed, sometimes as fast as an automobile on the expressway. And if you happen to get hit by that, if the water doesn't make an impact upon you, it's the debris that's carried inside of here, because it's carrying all the debris from automobiles to houses to ships to whatever it is. You make sure that you are in the opposite direction should this particular event occur. So that tidal surge does have an impact greatly upon the land. Flooding costs over approximately $1 billion per year to the federal government, and that's just a outset. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that there's flooding along the coastal areas. We also get flooded in the Midwest, the Mississippi River, for example, overflowing its banks. The various floods that happen locally from creeks and rivers and streams, and the enormous amount of monies and monetary outputs that are being done in order to rebuild in some cases, or relocate some of the pumping stations and areas in an effort to minimize that flooding. And then, of course, hurricanes are natural disasters that are going to impact humans, animals, and the environment. Of course they are. Not only are we going to be impacted by a hurricane along the coast, we can also be impacted by the hurricane a little bit further up in the Midwest. And you're going to say, now wait a minute, Dr. Maya, you just said that a hurricane happens along the coast. Absolutely correct. It does happen along the coast. That's where they happen. But it's the aftermath of that hurricane where it can travel from the coastal area all the way up to the Midwest. How many times have we in the Midwest have a spin-off from a very large hurricane, if it's a Cat 4 or a Cat 5, but we get the rains and the wind from that hurricane, but only in a different matter. It's not going to be those high intense winds, because it's overland, it's already drying up a little bit, shall we say. But eventually, for example, if it reaches here in Chicago, there's nothing saying that we can't get 40 or 50-mile-an-hour winds with torrential rains and perhaps a microburst out of it, depending on how soupy and humid the atmosphere is going to be. And we could get flooded out based on 4 to 5 inches of rain. So it's not just the hurricane that's going to make an impact on the coast. It also can make an impact here in the Midwest. So yeah, so hurricanes and flooding. So flooding is going to be caused by torrential rain. It's going to be caused by the tidal surges, as well as I mentioned with an earthquake and a tsunami. The most prominent time for those hurricanes are going to be June through October, due to the type of atmosphere, the sun's angle, as well as the humidity that's going to be included. Then flooding costs the federal government approximately $1 billion per year, if not more nowadays. And hurricanes are the natural disaster that is going to make an impact on all walks of life here with humans, animals, as well as the environment in general. Just to give you a little bit of background here on the next slide regarding some history, one of the most influential hurricanes that kind of started the awareness for hurricanes and hurricane warnings occurred in Galveston, Texas in around 1900. And that one had approximately 8,000 to 12,000 deaths. And during that time, especially along the coastal area, that's a lot of people. And our population has obviously increased, but for that particular era, that was unheard of. And the devastation that took place there was enormous, and due to the fact that a lot of people did not heed the warnings. Now, there's a gentleman that was a meteorologist that was studying the wind, and also had an idea of velocity of these winds. And in doing so, he made the warning and had it telegraphed over to Washington, D.C., that there's an impending storm, and that there should be some mobilization of people away from the shores. He was laughed at and he was shunned because of his methodologies. Well, lo and behold, a few days later, it was already too late due to the fact that the tidal surge started to pick up, due to the fact that a lot of the water started to recede and these huge tidal waves started to crash in. The wind started to pick up, and lo and behold, this major category hurricane came on land and almost literally destroyed the entire Galveston area. They had adequate warning. They had enough time to do so. However, the other officials did not seem fit that this is going to take place until it was too late. So they basically ignored his warnings. They ignored the signs and symptoms, if you will, of the atmosphere that was out there, and cost approximately 12,000 people's lives due to that ignorance of the warning. And then the cost back then was $30 million. Well, by today's standards, we're looking at approximately $4 billion that would impact this major area for Galveston. So you can imagine the amount of psychological damage that took place, the loss of lives, as well as the financial repercussions, because people didn't listen. And that's the communication aspect. Even as basic as communication was back then, even with Morse code and telegraphing and such, it makes an impact, saying that this is what's occurring, this is what I feel is going to happen. Do you have any opportunity to perhaps start sending people over here to assist us in our time of need? And unfortunately, when you have people that don't want to listen or don't want to take advice, much as I gave you in that previous 2 slides ago or whatever, dealing with leadership and listening to people and listening to your team, that makes a big difference. And in this case, it made a major difference in people's lives, as well as this financial standards that took place there. So a lot of those buildings were washed away. A lot of those buildings were just moved from one place to another and literally carried to the opposite side of the town, as well as a lot of people said that their family members were trapped in attics and things with the rising water. So you get the picture of what's taking place here. But always remember that if there's a warning out there and they're saying that this is bad, heed that warning, follow what they're telling you because they're probably right. And nowadays, especially with social media and technology, there's no reason why we can't be on top of things and understand that this may take place. And especially with the National Weather System and all their instruments and being able to predict things, sometimes it might not be as bad as they're going to say. But like we always say in emergency management, just prepare yourself for the worst and then hope for the best once this storm happens to come through. And then it's not only is it bad enough when you have a hurricane with all the devastating winds, but then you have the flooding issues. Then the flooding issue is caused by the excessive rain, the hurricane itself. And oh, by the way, if you weren't worried about global warming or the global seas rising, you have the melting ice and snow. And it is a fact that these ice caps that are melting, even with the current rate that they're saying that the ice caps are melting at approximately 1%, then it will raise the sea level approximately 1 foot along the coastal areas. That can be devastating, especially when you're having so many people that are living along the coastal areas. An example, for example, is Miami. That can be a major issue due to the fact that they're right along the coast, and Florida is basically a peninsula that's jutting out into the ocean. So we have to mind what's going on in our polar caps, even though we may be enjoying life in the sun and on the beaches. And then you have rainfall that's going to be extended over a short period of time, or if it's going to be a longer period of time. It's just going to depend on the type of storm, the initiative that's going to be by that storm. How many times have you been caught in a microburst? Yes, a microburst, meaning that all of a sudden the storm pops up, you have 4 to 5 inches of rain in a short period of time, and it has nowhere to go, especially if you happen to be living in an area that has much concrete. There's nowhere to go. It doesn't sink into the field anymore. It doesn't have natural drain off and runoff patterns. Now it's all standing around and it only can go into the sewers, and the sewer system becomes overloaded because there's so much water in a short period of time. Then flooding is definitely going to be an issue. And then you have the breaching of levees as well as some of the dams due to the force of water. Water is very powerful. Water moves things. Water moves buildings. Water shifts cars, just like a tornado lifts up cars and tosses it like a matchbox car. The same thing happens with water. It just naturally lifts up things and can push it for a great distance. And then as rainwater is going to accumulate and flow, then it overwhelms the capacity of the waterways, the drains, and then it causes flooding. Water seeks its own level, so it's going to be going wherever it can find room. So if you feel that you're going to get away with it, you really can't, because a lot of times the water is going to seek its own level, especially if it's going to be with an issue here such as a microburst. So flooding is going to be caused by excessive rains. It's going to be with hurricanes. Tornadoes are involved in that as well, and then also dealing with melting ice and snow. Then rainfall over an extended period of time or a shortened period of time will definitely create a havoc on your rivers, your streams, your tributaries, etc. And then it's going to provide an opportunity for flooding to occur, especially if you have levees that are compromised as well as dams that are going to be breached. And finally, the rainwater that accumulates, it can overwhelm the waterway and a capacity for it to maintain in a certain level, and it's going to cause flooding within that particular area or community. So now you're asking, well, there has to be something that we can do out there. Well, yeah, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they provide states and communities with the flood hazard and risk data information, as well as the river flow, the storm tides, hydraulic analyses, as well as rainfall and topographic surveys. So many times you can see ahead of time what's going to take place. It's almost like a geographic information system, GIS, in being able to identify some of the shortcomings or being able to see where the topography is and how much water is going to be contained. Definitely where the flood hazard is going to be. If it's right along the lake, you know that there's going to be a flood hazard. Same thing if homes are built along the river and you've experienced flooding in the past. This will definitely occur again. It might not be within 5 years, it might not be 10 years, more than likely you're going to have that 100-year flood or 500-year flood, as they say. It's going to occur. Some of the things, so expect the unexpected. And then some of the things that FEMA uses too is the information to create those flood hazard maps for mitigation and preparedness purposes. Of course, it's going to cost a little bit of money. It's going to be a little bit time consuming, and you're going to have to deal with that eventuality if you want to do this the right way and protect people within the community. So FEMA provides a good opportunity here for learning about community hazards, the risks that are associated with flooding, as well as providing an analysis based on your needs, as well as being able to provide a comprehensive approach or perhaps even a policy that you might be able to follow regarding the flood hazards and some of the higher areas that are concentrated within your neck of the woods, and then being able to prepare your community in the immediate future as well as in the long run. And finally, FEMA oftentimes provides some good quality opportunities for training, as well as identifying some of the main areas that are going to be impacted from floods. So communities can use the flood maps that FEMA provides to mitigate the threats of high-risk areas for the flooding, as well as being able to be a good steward and identify the vulnerable populations. And so it might be the aged and elderly, or it might be simply the pediatric populations that may need to be moved out of these areas that are identified as high-risk areas for vulnerability. And these populations with high-risk areas then develop an opportunity for preparedness, mitigation, and then some of the response efforts that are going to take place. It can take a lot of time and effort. I had the opportunity of working alongside a contractor group out of Indianapolis several years ago, and it took us approximately 7 months of meetings, preparatory work, and planning to finally get a comprehensive policy, to finally have maps developed and engineering specifics regarding what the situations are going to entail if this particular lake happened to flood, or if this tributary happened to overflow, or if this river happened to impact the community. What were the situations? What were we going to use? How are we going to go about it? And literally mapping out certain areas that are high risk areas. And a lot of the funding that we did receive for this, we used to build up our levees. We used to build up some of the dike areas that were needed because we had flooding in the past, but we learned from that and we utilized some of the funding that was given to us through grant funding. So as you can see, there's a lot of information that we covered in this lesson. We will be going onward in lessons 4 through 6 for our next collaborative session here. I hope you gained a little bit of insight out of this session regarding the issues of flooding and wildland fires and hurricanes, a little bit touching on leadership once again, as well as some of the psychological impacts that not only can be impacting our first responders, but impacting our community members as well. Our first responders are our first line of defense, but community members might be impacted by a disaster in a different method, and behavioral health services are definitely warranted for not only our first responders, but all of those in the community. So with that, I wish you good day. Thank you for attending our session for today, and I look forward to seeing you in our next collaborative session within a few weeks.